Daniel Mercer and Jason Cole, two cousins who grew up like brothers, bound by family and memories of small-town childhood. But what began as a story of loyalty and shared blood twisted into one of betrayal, greed, and murder. Behind their familiar smiles lay secrets that would shatter a community, and the shocking truth revealed that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one sitting at your family table. Daniel Mercer and Jason Cole were cousins who, from the outside, seemed inseparable. They grew up in the small town of Brookfield, where families knew one another by name and children played freely on quiet streets. Their childhood was filled with memories of fishing by the creek, camping trips with their uncles, and long summers spent riding bicycles until dusk. Family gatherings often saw the two side by side, laughing, planning mischief, or competing in games that always ended with someone storming off in mock anger. Everyone around them believed the bond they shared was unshakable. To their parents, the boys were more like brothers than cousins, tied not only by blood but also by the closeness of their upbringing. As the years passed, however, the natural closeness of childhood began to thin under the weight of adulthood. Daniel, with sharp eyes and an unyielding ambition, saw the town as too small for his dreams. He left for a few years after high school, working in construction companies across nearby cities, gaining experience and saving money. When he returned to Brookfield, he carried himself differently, with confidence that some admired and others quietly resented. He soon started his own construction business, promising growth and modern development for the town. Jason, on the other hand, stayed rooted in Brookfield. He was the dependable one, the kind of man who could fix an engine, lend a hand, or share a meal without ever asking for anything in return. He opened a small auto repair shop on the edge of town, modest but steady, and built a reputation for honesty. Neighbors trusted him, farmers brought him their trucks, and young drivers sought his advice when their cars made noises they couldn't explain. Jason's life was simple, and though he had fewer ambitions than Daniel, he carried himself with a quiet contentment. But beneath the surface of their different lives, cracks had begun to appear in their relationship. Daniel's return brought with it an air of superiority that rubbed Jason the wrong way. He often spoke of his projects as if they were proof of his greater success, dismissing Jason's repair shop as small-town work. Jason, though calm by nature, couldn't ignore the subtle jabs and dismissive remarks. Family gatherings, once filled with laughter, grew tense as cousins and siblings whispered about the strained bond between the two. What had once been playful competition in childhood began to sour into something far darker. Money deepened the rift. Daniel's business grew quickly at first, but growth came at a cost. He borrowed heavily, took risky contracts, and often needed financial backing to keep projects alive. Jason, being cautious with his earnings, had lent Daniel small amounts in the past, but he grew wary as the requests grew larger and more frequent. Resentment simmered when Jason refused to co-sign a loan that Daniel insisted was crucial for his company's future. To Daniel, the refusal was betrayal. To Jason, it was simply caution, a line he could not cross. Around town. People noticed the tension even if they did not fully understand it. Daniel and Jason still saw each other often, whether at church, in passing at the grocery store, or during family dinners, but their conversations grew shorter, their smiles less genuine. Daniel's ambition cast a shadow, and Jason's steady, humble lifestyle seemed to irritate him more with each passing year. It wasn't just money. It was pride, envy, and the slow corrosion of what had once been a deep and trusting bond. What no one in Brookfield could have known was how far Daniel's resentment had already spread. What appeared to be an ordinary family tension was in fact the beginning of a dangerous obsession. Daniel, desperate to keep his business alive and unwilling to accept failure, began to view Jason not as a cousin, not even as family, but as an obstacle standing in his way. The bond of blood that once united them was quietly unraveling, thread by thread, until all that remained was rivalry, bitterness, and a storm waiting to break. Jason Cole's disappearance began like a whisper, the kind of quiet worry that people brush off at first. On the evening he vanished, he closed his garage just as he always did, locking the doors and waving to a neighbor who happened to be watering her plants across the street. His truck was parked neatly outside his home when night fell, his keys and wallet resting on the small table by the door, and the television still clicked on to the local news. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but when Jason failed to show up for work the next morning, his employees grew uneasy. He was never late, never careless about his commitments. By noon, when phone calls went unanswered, the silence began to feel heavier than it should. His family reported him missing later that day, convinced something was wrong. The police started with routine questions. Did Jason have enemies, debts, or a reason to run away? The answers were always the same. He was steady, reliable, and not the kind of man to vanish. Volunteers gathered quickly, scouring the wooded edges of town and the back roads Jason often drove. Flyers with his picture went up on street poles, store windows, and gas stations. His face became impossible to miss, a kind expression, slightly worn from years of labor, staring back at strangers and friends alike. Days passed, then weeks. Each morning brought a fresh wave of hope that a clue would appear, followed by disappointment when nothing surfaced. His repair shop sat eerily quiet, cars gathering dust in the lot. The townspeople left candles and flowers outside the doors as if it were already a memorial. His disappearance became the topic at every diner booth, every grocery aisle, every church gathering. People speculated about accidents, about robbery gone wrong, about secret lives no one had known. Yet those who truly knew Jason found such theories impossible to believe. Investigators combed through his house, garage, and business records. Nothing suggested he had planned to leave. His bank accounts were untouched, his phone last pinged in the area near his home, and there were no signs of forced entry. The mystery deepened when they discovered that Jason had been entangled in a lawsuit with his cousin Daniel. The dispute centered around unpaid bills and allegations of mismanaged funds between their businesses. Though the matter was still in early stages, the tension it revealed raised eyebrows among the detectives. Family ties did not erase suspicion, and the idea that Jason's own blood could be at the center of his troubles began to take root quietly among those searching for answers. The investigation widened. Neighbors were questioned, security cameras from gas stations and intersections reviewed, and old acquaintances contacted. One small detail stood out. Jason had received multiple late-night calls in the days before his disappearance, all traced back to Daniel. When asked, Daniel dismissed them as casual conversations about business, nothing more. Still, the timing was suspicious. Detectives made note but lacked enough evidence to press further as weeks slipped into months. The initial panic gave way to a heavy sorrow. Search parties dwindled, and flyers faded in the weather. His mother stopped sleeping, his friends drove roads they had already checked a dozen times, and his employees gathered at the empty garage each morning in silence before heading home again. The town began to carry his absence like a scar, a reminder that even in a place as small and tight-knit as Brookfield, darkness could still creep in and take someone without warning. Though the trail seemed cold, detectives refused to give up. They sifted through every lead, retraced every step, and waited for the smallest mistake to crack the case open. What no one could predict was that the truth was waiting silently beneath the surface, hidden not far from the edges of town. Jason's disappearance was not the end of his story, but the beginning of a revelation that would unravel a shocking betrayal. One that few could have imagined when he first failed to come home that September night. 2 months after Jason Cole's disappearance, when the town had begun to carry its grief in silence, the truth finally began to surface in the most unexpected way. A group of hikers set out one chilly autumn afternoon to explore the dense woods just outside Brookfield. The trees were shedding their leaves, the forest floor scattered with orange and brown, and the air carried that familiar bite of approaching winter. As the hikers made their way down a narrow path, one of them noticed an unusual patch of disturbed earth. It wasn't natural. The soil was uneven, as if hastily turned and covered again. At first, they dismissed it as nothing more than an animal's digging. But as they drew closer, a faint smell hung in the air, heavy and sour, a smell that froze them in their tracks. Authorities were called immediately, and by nightfall the Woods had transformed into a crime scene lit by spotlights and buzzing with quiet urgency. Investigators carefully dug into the soil, peeling away layers of dirt and damp leaves until the outline of something human appeared. Wrapped in a shallow covering, the body had been left with little care, as if the person responsible believed. No one would ever stumble upon it. What they uncovered confirmed the darker suspicions. The remains belonged to Jason Cole. Forensic experts worked tirelessly, piecing together the grim details. Jason had suffered severe head trauma, his skull fractured by what appeared to be repeated blows with a blunt object. There were no signs of defensive wounds, suggesting he might have been caught off guard, perhaps even attacked by someone he trusted. The shallow grave spoke volumes. Whoever buried him had acted in haste, more concerned with concealment than with erasing every trace. In a town where hope had lingered stubbornly, the confirmation of Jason's death sent shockwaves through families, neighbors, and friends who had clung to the idea that he might still return home alive. Investigators retraced every lead with fresh determination. The fact that Jason's body was found not far from Brookfield suggested the killer was someone familiar with the area, someone confident enough to believe the Woods would guard their secret. The brutality of the attack eliminated theories of a random act of violence. This was personal. The question of motive became clearer with each detail uncovered. Attention turned sharply toward Daniel Mercer, the cousin who had been linked to Jason through business disputes and late-night phone calls. His name had surfaced repeatedly in whispered conversations across town, but now investigators had reason to look closer. Forensic technicians combed through Daniel's financial records and discovered a trail of unusual bank transfers between him and Jason in the weeks leading up to the murder. These weren't friendly loans. They were large sums, shifting back and forth, leaving behind a haze of unanswered questions about what Jason might have been withholding or refusing to agree. Further evidence came from the forensic team's meticulous work. Tiny fibers clung to Jason's clothing, fibers that matched the upholstery of Daniel's vehicle. A faint bloodstain, nearly invisible to the naked eye, was later detected in the trunk of that same car. Though small, the discovery was damning, each piece forming a puzzle that pointed to one conclusion. The town, once united in grief, now buzzed with suspicion. People who had grown up admiring Daniel's determination began to look at him with wary eyes. Old memories of the cousins together, laughing, working side by side, acting like brothers, were now poisoned by the horrifying thought that one had buried the other beneath the autumn leaves. Jason's discovery turned the missing person investigation into a full-scale homicide case. The Woods, once a quiet place of refuge for hikers and families, became a place of dread, the site of betrayal carved into the community's memory. For the detectives, the case was no longer about finding Jason. It was about proving who had ended his life and why. And as the evidence mounted, one chilling reality became harder to ignore. The man responsible for the brutal act was likely not a stranger, but someone Jason had once trusted more than most. As the investigation pressed forward, the pieces of Jason Cole's murder began to form a picture far darker than anyone in Brookfield could have imagined. The discovery of his body had shifted the case into grim clarity, but understanding why Daniel Mercer, his own cousin, could be responsible required unraveling a tangled web of debts, desperation, and greed. Detectives dug into Daniel's financial life, and what they uncovered painted a portrait of a man whose ambition had devoured him from the inside out. Daniel's construction company, once hailed as a promise of growth for the small town, was crumbling beneath the weight of reckless spending. He had borrowed heavily to fund projects that stalled before completion, cut corners that left him facing lawsuits, and gambled on contracts he was never able to secure. Behind the polished image he presented at family gatherings and in public, Daniel was drowning. Bill collectors hounded him, banks refused his calls, and investors demanded answers he could not provide. In the months before Jason vanished, Daniel had turned repeatedly to his cousin for help. Records revealed that Jason had loaned him money. More than once, small amounts at first, then larger sums that Daniel never repaid. Each transaction was followed by promises, claims that a new project would pay off or that a big client was just around the corner. Jason, cautious but compassionate, had tried to support his cousin, but his patience wore thin as the requests escalated. When Daniel asked him to co-sign a substantial loan that could have kept the company afloat, Jason refused. To him, the risk was too great. He had his own small shop to protect, and he could not jeopardize everything he had worked for just to patch the growing holes in Daniel's empire. That refusal became the spark that ignited Daniel's rage. To him, Jason's caution wasn't just a financial decision, it was betrayal. He convinced himself that Jason had turned against him, that his cousin, the one person who should have been loyal above all others, had chosen to watch him fail. Friends later told investigators they had noticed Daniel's demeanor shift during that time. His charm was edged with bitterness, his confidence replaced with a simmering frustration that he barely kept hidden. Forensic accountants followed the trail of money and uncovered another disturbing truth. In the weeks before Jason disappeared, Daniel had initiated late-night transfers between their accounts, shifting funds in a way that suggested pressure or manipulation. Investigators speculated that Daniel might have been trying to force Jason into compliance, using financial entanglement as leverage. Instead, the disagreements had escalated into something irreparable. Physical evidence tied Daniel even closer to the crime. The blood trace in his car trunk, faint but undeniable, aligned with the timeline of Jason's disappearance. Rental records showed that Daniel had borrowed excavation tools just days before Jason's body was discovered in the woods, an eerie coincidence too sharp to ignore. The shallow grave that hikers stumbled upon bore the marks of hurried digging, consistent with the tools Daniel had checked out and returned. With each revelation, the narrative shifted from suspicion to near certainty. The investigators pieced together the chilling sequence. Daniel, cornered by debt and desperate to save his collapsing business, arranged to meet Jason under the guise of resolving their disputes. What began as a confrontation over money spiraled into violence, ending in Jason's death. Rather than face ruin, Daniel chose betrayal, exchanging family loyalty for a chance at survival. For the people of Brookfield, the unfolding details struck at the very heart of their community. It wasn't just the loss of Jason, a man they trusted and admired. It was the horror of realizing that the person responsible sat across from him at family dinners, shared his childhood memories, and knew the exact roads where his body could be hidden. The web of greed had consumed Daniel so completely that even blood ties were not enough to stop him. By the time detectives gathered all the evidence, the case no longer rested on whispers or circumstantial connections. It stood on a foundation of proof, each discovery pointing to the same conclusion. Jason's murder was not the work of a stranger or a passing criminal. It was a calculated act born from desperation, greed, and envy. And at the center of it all stood Daniel Mercer, a man who had once been considered family's pride, now exposed as its greatest betrayal. When the evidence against Daniel Mercer became undeniable, the arrest came swiftly. Police cars pulled up to his home on a grey morning, the flashing lights reflecting off windows as neighbors gathered quietly to watch. Daniel stood on his porch, expression unreadable, as officers placed him in handcuffs. Some describe him as calm, almost resigned, as though he knew the net had finally closed around him. For the town of Brookfield, it was a moment that mixed shock with grim relief. The whispers had become truth, and the cousin once admired for his ambition was now the prime suspect in a brutal murder. The trial began months later, drawing widespread attention beyond the town's borders. Journalists filled the courtroom, their cameras capturing every detail, while locals lined up each day to secure a seat inside. Prosecutors laid out the case with methodical precision. They began with the financial evidence, Daniel's failing business, the unpaid debts, the repeated pleas for loans that Jason had finally refused. They presented bank records showing suspicious late-night transfers, followed by the rental receipts for excavation tools obtained days before Jason was buried. The narrative was chilling, a story of ambition twisted into desperation. The physical evidence carried even more weight. Forensic experts testified about the fibers from Daniel's vehicle that matched Jason's clothing, and the faint trace of blood discovered in the trunk. Pathologists described the blunt force trauma that had ended Jason's life, suggesting an attack that came without warning, striking down a man who likely never had the chance to defend himself. Then came the most damning piece: surveillance footage from a roadside camera showing Daniel's truck driving toward the wooded area on the night Jason vanished. Though the footage was grainy, the timing was irrefutable. The defense struggled to counter the avalanche of evidence. They painted Daniel as a man under pressure, insisting the money issues did not prove he was capable of murder. They suggested the blood in the trunk could have been transferred innocently, given the cousins' closeness. But these arguments rang hollow against the mountain of forensic proof and the undeniable motive rooted in greed. The jury listened intently, their expressions tightening with each new revelation. Throughout the proceedings, Jason's family sat silently in the gallery. His mother clutched a framed photograph of her son, refusing to look at Daniel as the story of betrayal unfolded in front of her. Friends who had once respected Daniel now shook their heads in disbelief, unable to reconcile the boy who had grown up alongside Jason with the man who now stood accused of ending his life. Every testimony deepened the sense of tragedy, not only for the loss of Jason, but for the destruction of a family bond that had once seemed unbreakable. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom was filled with a tense silence that lasted only a few hours. Their return was swift, their decision clear: guilty of first-degree murder. The words echoed through the chamber, final and heavy. Daniel showed little emotion as the verdict was read, his eyes fixed ahead as though already detached from the world around him. The judge delivered the sentence soon after: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Brookfield was left to grapple with the aftermath. Jason's funeral, held months earlier, had drawn hundreds, but now the community carried the additional burden of knowing that his life had been stolen not by a stranger, but by family. Conversations at the diner, the church, and the grocery store all circled back to the same haunting question: how could blood betray blood so coldly? Parents pulled their children closer, neighbors looked at each other with a trace of suspicion, and trust felt thinner than it had before. For Jason's family, the wound would never fully close. His garage remained locked, tools collecting dust inside, a frozen reminder of a life interrupted. The cousins' childhood memories, once recounted with fondness, were now tainted by the knowledge of how their story had ended. Daniel sat behind prison walls, his ambition and freedom stripped away, his name forever marked by the crime he committed. The story of Jason Cole's murder became one of the darkest chapters in Brookfield's history, a cautionary tale whispered to future generations about how envy and desperation can twist even the closest bonds into something unrecognizable. Long after the trial ended and the cameras left, the memory lingered. The townspeople could still see Jason's smile in the photos that had once covered their lampposts, and they could still remember the sickening chill that came when they learned that his own cousin had been the one to bury him in the cold earth of the woods.